All right. Get my remote class started. Get our slides. All right, questions from yonder yesterday. Do we remember yesterday? Besides it being Monday? Yep, a lot of certificate stuff. Public, private key infrastructure, where we use certificates, how we get certificates, how we manage them internally, externally. Yep, he had his sunglasses on because he left his other glasses at work or at home or somewhere.
I heard the story.
He wasn't that loud.
Only answered a few questions, but
True.
we don't need to pay attention, so
It's okay. You know, if I didn't ask you, who would?
it's all good.
I hear you, I'm more than listening to that. Say it louder. After last night, I'm big friend day.
How'd your thing go last night?
Oh, it was great.
Really good.
Is there sarcasm?
There is a little bit. So she read it and she had signed it. She gave me the hard copy of it. Not that I did my presentation and my talk. And the peanut gallery in the back had to stand up and say,
Cheered her on.
yeah,
My team.
in front of, yeah, the city council on live video. But it went really well.
Good.
Yeah, I think it's a great start to it, and I think she's actually like, I do need to confirm, but I think she's the first mayor in the state to sign that proclamation. And it started out as a presidential proclamation, it's the governor's proclamation. 48 of the 50 states governors signed it. Ours has signed it for at least 8 years, I believe.
Wow.
So just saying that October 7th is really recognized. I said, yeah, it's that, but it's all year too. So
Well, very good.
anyway, so yeah.
Well, I'm glad it went well.
Yeah, I do too. There's also what is it, National Miscarriage and Big Loss or something. Then somebody else got the mayor's signed a proclamation for them as well.
Oh, okay. Almost there, 1 second. All right, I'm trying to get into my virtual lab. Gives me an error, so we'll see if it lets me continue, hopefully. If not, we'll react accordingly. Well, we'll see if this comes up. Right now it's saying it's unavailable. I don't know if they're doing an update.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll let that figure out. Dang it.
Trace. Probably have to call Microsoft.
All right. Well, we'll let this lab try to load. All right, so today we talk about identity and access services. We'll get into our account management, which is what I'm trying to get into the virtual lab for, so we can get in and work with Active Directory, or at least see it. And then we'll get into secure network design. And it looks like the lab is not cooperating this second. All right, so identity and access services. Gosh, excuse me. So this kind of ties into how we finished yesterday. Several of the things that come up in this unit we did talk about. I'll just kind of go through the beginning. I won't hit every single highlight, but at least kind of bullet point certain areas. And we'll go from there. So when we talk about policies, we do talk about implicit or explicit. That came up yesterday. Same with our single sign-on. Getting into our directory service, LDAP, right? Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. We'll get into the AAA again. We'll also bring up Radius, which is kind of our remote authentication services. More on a corporate kind of a like an ISP type solution. So we're talking solution for multiple connectivity types, and then did we already do this? We talked about OpenID and maybe not. All right.
No, we haven't done that yet.
That all runs together. All right, so authorization again. We're talking about once we know who you are. Yesterday we talked about all the different ways we can do it. One way, multi-factor, biometrics, username and password, getting into additional third-party tools. We do hear the term implicit or explicit, right? So whether I explicitly allow, we're either dealing with an allow or a deny. That's how the rule starts, right? And we have these ACLs, these access control lists. And these access control lists, we see group policy, we see Active Directory, we see Cisco, we see Juniper, all these routers, switches, hardware, servers have these lists, which is kind of our driver's license. We talked about yesterday with Kerberos or Cerberus. So when you log on to Active Directory, right, the three-headed dog that guards our network for us. And so we talk about those types of elements there. So simple topic, it's repetitive as far as how we dealt with it, but it is one of the key things. If we go biblical, in the mouth of two or three witnesses shall every word be established. I don't know where that just came from, but Philippians 2:14, and I have no idea where that came from, if that's even right. But when we hear things again and again and again, it's typically because they are important. And so we deal with this AAA kind of across the board in many, many different ways, whether it's physical, whether it's technical, whether it's logical, right? One of the struggles that I think people have is dealing with the physical network compared to the logical network, right? What is the logical part of our network? Well, let's reverse that. What is the physical part of our network? When you say physical network, throw out things. What's that?
Servers.
Servers,
Workstations.
Router.
routers, switches, infrastructure,
Firewall.
border devices, internal devices, connectivity from site to site, right? That's our LAN, CAN, MAN, WAN, PAN, all those types of things. So when we talk physical, that is the media or the medium that data is transmitted and stored. So if that's physical, what is logical?
Must be the software.
Okay, but what part of, for us, we're dealing with Active Directory, and that is the software that controls access to it. If there's just a file out there, there's really not a logical piece to it, but how we access that through rights and permissions, that is a logical piece. So when we have Active Directory, it's software, it is logically overlaid with our physical, right? Because we have to control, with Active Directory, do you guys deal with sites in Active Directory and replication between sites?
We don't.
Okay.
Not really. We don't, all our DCs are, yeah, they're in one side.
Okay. So when we deal with sites, we can actually take a physical location and apply logical pieces. So if you start up in this physical building, I'm going to get specific information compared to if I'm physically somewhere else. But regardless of me physically being there, when Killian logs on with his username or password, that logical piece ties into the physical outlay. So a lot of times we struggle, or at least when we're new to this or trying to figure out, I have to make sure I separate the physical infrastructure from the logical infrastructure. Security deals with both, right? I have a physical bodyguard. I have physical devices that biometrically control access, right? And then I also have logical. I have rights and permissions and access control it. So when we talk authorization, it is a key part, making sure who comes in. Policies, right? We have policies so that they're ignored. Well, do as I say, not as I do. We hope that there's policies there so they enforce or at least provide a guideline to how we should do things. Some policies are very strict, right? If you don't follow this, if you don't lock your computer on the third time, you're fired, right? So if you ever lose your access card, you have to file a report, you get written up, whatever it may be. Others, it's kind of like, all right, go talk to Steve, he'll take care of you kind of a thing. So we have different levels of policies for our organization. And then, of course, how do we go through and define those policies? So basic policies, implicit deny. We have our included in that. I'm just going to say all four. We have allow, we have deny, I have implicit, and I have explicit. And we have, so we have several options here. I can say allow. So if I have my, right, my router, and I have segment 1 connected, segment 2. We don't really care if they're on separate floors, if they're in separate corners. When we design a physical network and we're dealing with security, what are some of the considerations that we have to make? Where do they physically reside, or what is their job function, right? I can keep accounting together, HR together. I can keep the graphics department together. Why? Because their data is so huge, huge file sizes and so forth. So when we're dealing with all of this, authorization, infrastructure, it's almost always going to be, do I design it physically or do I design it based on job function or job title, whatever it may be. So most of this section and the next section or two, we're dealing with 5% black, 5% white, 90% gray. Most things will work in most instances. It's just what is best for your environment. So when we have, and let's do a third one. So I can have an access control list and say, at this point, we're going to allow any traffic is allowed both ways. Over here, I can say, I am only going to allow traffic from segment 3. So if it's coming from segment 1, I'm going to deny it. So we have all these who, what, where, when, why. I can allow it from here. I can say Jeremy only is allowed to on that network. So we have to kind of change hats. We have to think, okay, where do I want everybody allowed? Do I want certain people allowed? Do I want certain types of protocols allowed? And then we allow, we block. Okay? So a lot of options there. If you want to get more into that, take the Cisco class because there's tons. I mean, you're talking, the router here is what's controlling all that flow. So the access control lists here are extremely important physically for the infrastructure. That's why we have a firewall, right? So we have our firewall that goes out to the internet. This is a huge place where we're dealing with explicitly or implicitly deny. So unless I say you can do it, you're not allowed. And that's kind of the joke yesterday with my daughter is unless I explicitly say A, B, C, D, she won't get to D without doing other things. So we have all those options. Least privilege. So here's the question. Do you like to keep your network open and then lock it down as people goof around or mess up? Or do you start locked down and as people prove themselves, you allow more permissions? Those are kind of the two models we have. What do you guys do?
Well, what did we come into?
Sure.
Was that it was open
Okay.
and then it would deny. We're trying to change that. And
Perfect.
Block and right, block and only allow certain things as requested and approved by upper management.
Well, and that makes your job easier in the long run. It might be a little bit more to convert it, but once you get there, you worry less, you have to deal with less because you know they can't do it unless they come to me and I say they can. As opposed to, oh, Tim, he has access to everything, right? And we talked earlier about when we deal with problems, 70% of our network problems are from internal means.
Right.
Of which 15% of that is malicious, which means 55% of it is just being idiots and doing stupid, oh, Mary loves me, oh, let me grow this and do this and have this and so forth. So typically we want to deal with the least privilege model. So know that for the test. Single sign-on, authenticate once, authorize many. I think we've talked about that. There's pros and cons to that, right? One login gets me many places, but if it becomes compromised, many places could be accessible. Simplify account management. We talked about group policy yesterday. There's thousands of settings. You know, is it Monday? Killian says, I'm going to go change 100 policies today. No, he's not going to do that on a Monday. He may do that in the very beginning, but we're going to go through and keep it as simplified as we can. That typically ties into our least privilege as well. Compromising an account may compromise multiple applications and then difficult to implement on public networks. So when we're at the library, if you've been to a, excuse me, crap. If you've been to a library recently and sit at a computer, what do you typically see or expect to see? Okay. I got to go to the librarian, get a username, password. Is it the same password for all machines or the same account? Probably, maybe not. They may have a unique login for each computer. And then once I get into it, I expect very little, maybe a browser, maybe a Word document or a Word application or Excel. They lock down a lot of different things. And then there's always a disclaimer, whatever you do, make sure you log out. Don't save any account settings because it's a public computer. When we log into Windows for the first time, if we don't have networking enabled, right, it's going to say, hey, you're not connected to a network. Do you want to connect to a private network or do you want this to be a public network? Warning if it's public. So basic kind of authorization ideas that we deal with. Now, most of us in the world are dealing with Active Directory, some sort of a directory service. The protocol we use in Active Directory, LDAP, right? Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. What did we learn about protocols in general? Do we have to abide by them? Can we kind of say, I don't like this part of the protocol, I want to switch this? Protocols, it's there. If I want to use TCP/IP, I have to follow certain rules. If I want to use OSPF in my router, right, open shortest path first, I can say, okay, I want to install OSPF, and if I want to support it, I have to buy routers to support OSPF. Unless you're Cisco, and Cisco says, I like OSPF, I like RIP, we're going to create our own protocol, which is the Enhanced Interior Gateway Protocol, EGRIP, which is very good, but they're big enough, that's their standard, and so they said, oh, we like this, we're going to create our own set of rules, and eventually it worked so well that it became an open standard and a protocol. So when we have protocols, we need to follow the rules. Can Linux work with Active Directory? Yes, because they both have, or we need to make sure they both support Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. So as long as they support those rules, they can have access across the board. It doesn't mean that it's going to map 100% to 100%, but you can do most things through Linux on a Windows network if you have to. Right, we talked about Novell, right? Novell did not start off using TCP/IP. They used IPX, SPX. But here's kind of the dilemma that they dealt with 20, 25 years ago. Novell said, I'm going to build a product, and what was their really good product? It was a server, right? And Microsoft said, yeah, they've got the server. I'm going to build the client that connects to the server. So one Novell server, 200 computers, 200 to 1, and guess what? In the background, they're sitting saying, oh, we'll develop a server, right? We had NT Workstation, or we had NT and NT 4.0, and then 2000, and on and on and on. And then they get into the other services, your email server, your SQL server, IIS is your web server. So we get into all these different services, and over the couple decades, Microsoft has come up with a very good server product. And where do we see Novell nowadays? Who's seen or worked with Novell in the last 10 years? Not me. It was GroupWise. I don't even know if it's the same name, but I know they also went open source with Linux as their backend at some point. So if Novell uses IPX, SPX, and the rest of the world use TCP/IP, how do we make them work? And this is where, to me, this is kind of what killed Novell, because they said IPX is the way to go. Everybody else said, no, TCP/IP. It's like the old VHS, Betamax, right? Laserdisc, DVD, Blu-ray, whatever it is. So if I wanted my Windows clients to connect, I had to have a Novell connector. So my Windows machine went to the connector that translated to the server. So if I'm translating from one language to another, what are some of the negatives of that? Overhead. It's going to take longer, right? If you speak Japanese, I speak English. If Jess is our translator, I have to go to Jess, who has to translate to him. Now, the good thing is we can still converse, but the bad thing is it's going to take time. Jess is busy because she's handling 2 conversations now, and there's one other problem. Does every word in the English language match a word in the Japanese language? No. So what happens when she hears a word from Kyle and has to put it into Japanese? Let's make something up that kind of gets the idea. So things can get lost. So when we deal with our translators, LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, we're dealing with speaking English to English, and maybe a few times I need to go to Jess to translate in between. And there's our access control list. We have our database. What are objects in Active Directory? This is kind of a coding term when we talk about objects. But if I were to say every day, if you're in Active Directory, you are using objects. What would some of those objects be? Users. computers, organizational units. Okay, and these objects have attributes. What is an attribute? Another word we sometimes use is a parameter. So what would be some attributes of a user object?
First name, last name.
Thank you. All right, so we have our user. That's our object. Attributes, first name, last name, address, login. Okay, on and on. Correct. Now, the SID is not created by me. The SID is assigned automatically. And this gets a little deeper in Active Directory when we talk about master operations, right? We have the PDC, who's heard PDC emulator? Mike probably has. In Active Directory, there are 5 pieces that replicate. One of them is the PDC emulator. And what that does is that assigns SIDs to every object in the domain. This is where Windows 2000 kind of revolutionized the server objects. Because when we had Windows NT, we had a limitation of 40,000 objects. It could only give out unique SIDs, right, a security identifier, for 40,000 objects. So if I'm Microsoft and I have 10,000 people, immediately I've got 10,000 user objects, 10,000 computer objects, 10,000 workstation objects, 10,000 office, and I'm done. So I can no longer sustain Microsoft.com. I have to create another domain. So I have to go idaho.microsoft.com. That was our limitation in the early days. Now, when Windows 2000 came out with Active Directory, we can have billions of objects. Actually, Windows 2000 was million. Now we can get up to billions with the 2012, 16, 19 servers. So when we talk design, we talk about DNS. That'll come up a little bit later. But when we talk about objects, we have these attributes. Here's a quiz question. What is schema?
Basically, the layout or the design of the Active Directory. The whole.
That's my Visio map, right? That is my map that identifies everything in Active Directory.
It's basically like what's a good word for primary key.
Okay, primary keys, identifiers,
It basically tells
where it is, what attributes can it have, those kind of things. We typically never have to go in and change the schema, although we can. The only time we might have to change the schema, and an example would be, let's say we have a user account that has, you know, first name, last name, login, ... Let's say I want to add, say we're a very family-oriented business, and we want to add attributes for first child, second child, third child, or maybe pet. I mean, it's not a realistic example. If I went and updated the schema, that would, that could add additional attributes. But they're not going to put your favorite pet because nobody uses it. But if you have to, you can alter the schema. So that's one of the things that comes into Active Directory, where we can, and I only say that because we can extend the attributes there. We have our X500 and our LDAP. Oh, excuse me. Right, so X500, that's our domain tree, that's our structure, right? We have a forest, we have trees, and multiple domains would be multiple trees. Okay, so we're dealing with the naming structure as far as that goes. When we get into our X500, we're also tying into our LDAP. So that, for us, LDAP is Active Directory. That's our domain account. All right, questions on that? Most of us on a domain are dealing with security and authorization through these types of objects. And we can even create router objects and switch objects and other things if we choose to. Okay. When we get into our X500, every name is unique to itself. I cannot have duplicate names. Now I could have, so in this case, in each part of the attribute is defined. So we're going to have a CN equals whatever that value is. OU equals Idaho. Organization, locality, state, country, domain. So we're going to see, and in your book, I believe they have it.
Do we still use that type of nomenclature, whether with the better word, not the better
In
word?
Active Directory.
In Active Directory?
No.
Yep.
We do?
Yeah.
Now,
Create or to create or to, okay.
you typically won't see it this way, but if you're dealing with any sort of scripting, you're going to do this.
Okay.
And if you're
I remember
doing,
from years ago,
Yeah.
that we were.
and if you're dealing with like bulk imports using comma delimited or line separated files or values, then you're going to deal with this.
Okay.
Or, and Mike I know is an expert in this, PowerShell.
Are you like?
I kind of joke because I don't use it all the time. I'm a GUI guy,
It's nice to know
but
what he is because. you're-
Yeah.
okay.
I asked, I used it all the time.
and PowerShell is it's Microsoft's command line tool. So everything that I do in Active Directory, right click, add this, right click, change this, right click, sync this, I can go into PowerShell, access the object, set its value to something else, or change its value to something else. And Microsoft came out with this in 2008 server to compete directly with Linux and that whole open source model. Because the whole thing with Linux is I can install a server and it does not have any graphical user interface. They say that a server, the graphic interface can take up 90% of the processor time. So if I follow Linux's model and remove the graphic side of things, I'm freeing up potentially a lot of resources. So, and then there's our schema where we can go through and identify those. I don't remember seeing the X500 distinguished names on the test, but I do remember LDAP, single sign-on, some of those. So typically this is going on, but it's behind the scenes, unless we're dealing with scripting of any kind. Right, but it kind of makes sense. I can say, here's my common name, or canonical name, they'll say sometimes. It is webmaster. It is a part of the OU, which is marketing, which is a part of the object widget that's part of Great Britain and then part of the root. So basically, through this tree structure, I can get anywhere I need to go through the naming standards. Now, this is going to be a Linux model as far as seeing those things. We typically deal with this type of a structure in DNS with our DNS names and our domain names, right? And just like certificates, DNS resolves two places: public internet, private networks. Okay. And you'll see several questions on DNS and Security Plus and Net Plus, right? Because DNS is resolving a name to an IP address. And there's some danger there security-wise where people can, do a reverse ARP or change DNS values and say, yes, Google is server 1, but I'm going to say Google is server 10, which is over here, and spoof it. And suddenly they're sending it to me instead of sending it to where they should. And there's things internally that we deal with for DNS that kind of make it easy for us as far as updates and encryption and whatnot. So LDAP security, we have LDAP S, which is basically almost everything we see now has an S equivalent. I was watching, any of you watch TED Talks? Okay, I watched a couple of those. I got in about 10 o'clock and was watching some. I was actually watching some on the kind of about the dark web, deep web, which is a kind of a foundation underlying, not hacker mentality necessarily, but there is some things there. Anyway, this one guy was talking about browsers, and 10, 15 years ago, almost every page you went to had an HTTP : / name. And if I went to buy something, we almost had to go up and visually see, okay, am I on HTTPS? Because if I'm doing an online transaction, I want to make sure it's secure. And he made the comment that that's how it used to be, but now almost everything is the reverse. Almost everything now is an HTTPS by default. So some of the changes that have occurred, why the change? Well, the software, the browsers, technology has allowed us to have more options, right? If you bought a brand new Ford Mustang 20 years ago and bought a brand new Ford Mustang today and sat the two side by side, what would be similar?
The name?
The name. Maybe the engine, V8, perhaps.
Maybe tired.
Maybe.
Maybe exhausted.
Some of the so the transmission, there's still an engine, those kind of things. So let's just say if they're close, we'll count them. So basic engine, basic transmission, 4 wheels, those kind of things. What would be different? Okay, sleeker, more aerodynamic. Not only is it sleeker and more aerodynamic, we know that there were hours and hours of testing to make sure that it is more sleeker instead of just like, hey, that looks cool. Okay, much more computer driven as opposed to physical parts. Would I have backup cameras? Would I have the type of I probably had a 8-track or a cassette tape. Nowadays, if my daughter saw that, she would not know what it is. And I was telling Jess about this. Last year, my wife and I went out on a date. We got a call, and they were trying to order Idaho pizza. And my daughter's 16 and 18. They were 15 and 17. And she called, and she's like, I think Idaho Pizza's out of business. They're not answering their phone. And she's like, well, what is it? She goes, I just keep hearing this boom, burn, burn. And my wife was like, that's a busy signal. And they're like, what? She goes, yeah, because they're so used to call waiting. What's even better is about 5 minutes later, Caitlin called. She's like, it's okay, Mom, we fixed it. We got the pizza ordered. I'm like, good job. Way to fix that call waiting. But those are some of the differences, right? We have a very different world. So if I'm looking at the internal guts, the software, the computer pieces, all the options available from 20 years ago to now, just take that and switch it to software. So of course nowadays we can do more. We can do it faster. We can do it more efficiently. What happens if you go to purchase something at Walgreens and their purchasing system is down? Life is over. You see them pull out that credit card. But there's a problem with that. If you don't have a credit card with an embossed name, it doesn't work. And a lot of them, I know Cap Ed, they'll print them right there and it's just laser etched on it. So yes, there's a lot of good, but we kind of joke that, heck, if tech goes down, we are dead as a society. I don't have cash. My watch doesn't work anymore. Now I got to go to the bank. Oh, the bank doesn't give, So just think of when we talk about changes, when we talk about access, security, take that, what it used to be and what we're allowed now, and just say, okay, well, that makes sense. Google Chrome does this. 15 years ago, the #1 browser, Internet Explorer. By far, Internet Explorer. Now, it's almost the opposite. Now it's Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, and then their new one, I forget the name now. Edge, thank you. So, we see these things go. So, long kind of side note, but a lot of what we're seeing now is bringing in that security, that secure layer. This stuff is still the same, right? The Mustang still has an engine, still has a transmission. You're either allowed or denied. You're either implicit or you're explicit, right? Explicitly allow Jess in the room, and that's it. So everybody else, is your name Jess? You're allowed. Anybody else? I'm just going to assume that they're not.
It's implicitly allow or disallow her.
I either I would explicitly allow,
Okay.
which means she shows me her ID, I see that it is Jess, and I allow, and then the rest would be implicitly denied.
Okay.
It's just assumed. The other option would be explicitly allow Jess, explicitly deny everyone but Jess.
Okay.
But instead of making two steps, I can say explicitly allow her, everybody else is just denied.
That's it.
Yeah. Radius. You'll see questions on this, both Net Plus, Security Plus. You guys deal with Radius?
Yeah.
Like it, hate it, doesn't matter?
It's there.
Yep. What do we like about Radius?
It puts another security feature.
Okay. We can integrate that with network access policies, security policies. Radius is a single point of entry. And typically, who is using our Radius server? Is Jess on the third floor in graphics using Radius? Probably not, because she's internal. Right? Mike works from home. Killian's our salesman on the road. You deal, now again, we can change hats. So we're dealing with, if you have 500, 600 people and you have 10, 15 people coming, working from home, yeah, you could use Radius. It's a bit much as far as what it can do. Now let's switch to Albertsons, and you have hundreds and hundreds of people that work from home and travel. This is where the power of Radius comes in, because now Radius allows all these different types of devices and mobility, and it authenticates based on what's running behind the network. So an ISP would be great for this. How successful would an ISP be if they said, we want to provide you internet access, and as long as you have an iPhone 10, you can come to us. Anything else, sorry, we can't support. They probably would not be very successful or last very long. Radius is one of the tools that allows us to say, you can use your Android, you can use your BlackBerry, you can use this laptop, that laptop, Linux, Windows, Mac, and Radius can bring that in and secure that. AAA, you'll see that again, Net Plus, Security Plus, we've said it several times. This is not the car service, this is our authorization, authentication, authorization, and then accounting or auditing.
Where's the standoff underway in Nampa?
Like, please stand up.
Well, please stand up. Spots. Did you?
It's been going on all day.
I guess it says updated 137. I didn't hear this one. I guess it was. Yeah. I wonder if they finally took her.
Last I heard, well, before we left, they had.
Just somebody,
The lady, she had a rifle in the house, but they didn't know she had it.
Oof, that's like right down the road. 1,300 from yours? Oh.
take the long way home.
That was a nice little semi on the freeway today. That was good.
You were on going the other direction. How did that look?
That's pretty bad.
Sorry, we're talking about track just a little bit.
Those are the guys you work with.
I have not, I haven't talked to them all day. I'll get it down. Well, you love one.
They were down the way.
You love one with your mustache.
Okay, we don't need to know what Radius stands for or our TACACs stand for, but you just need to know what they are doing. They are dealing with our authentication, authorization, accounting, as far as connecting from the outside to the inside. Okay, so we get into it. Let me see if this works. All right, so we're getting into our wireless clients. We're getting into our remote clients, right? This is Killian on the road sales. This is Mike working from home. This is Jess working from her car. They all connect to the internet, connect to our remote access server, our RAS server, our Radius. Then they're going to go through Radius. Basically now goes into the network and contacts to say, okay, is this the right username? Is this the right password? I can also use Radius for people internally, so this here is an intranet. What's the difference? We know what internet is. We know what extranet is, I think. What is an intranet? Okay, it's the company's private internet, so HR, those kind of things. My wife, if she wants to access certain documents, she has to be on a St. Luke's network. She can't do it from home. What about an extranet? This is going to be our partnership with Micron, and now we have a specific extranet relationship. So we see that much more business corporate side, but typically we're going to deal internet and/or intranet. But the nice thing here, and the reason we have this Radius, right, is I have these internet clients. If I don't have this here, they are now going to go on possibly through the firewall or at the firewall on the network and authenticate. Now I have a central point that can now handle that offload and deal with that for me. And with Radius, I can have many Radius clients talking to many Radius servers. In fact, so if we're Albertsons and we've got 5,000 remote clients, I can have a dozen remote access or Radius clients that handle all those connections, and then they go back and talk to 20 Radius servers. And they talk about putting this into a cluster, right, where I have multiple servers. So again, that's the design part. As long as we understand the steps and the process, okay, as long as we know where these Radius clients are in these Radius servers or our authentication servers, that's the key. But we can also know that if we've got thousands of people, we can add and deal with additional options or clustering or load balancing that will assist us as far as the workload goes.
Quick speak chair here, sorry.
You're fine. You want to switch?
That's
We know you're either rocking yourself to sleep or you are asleep. All right, so Radius connects our remote user clients. The client's going to prompt for credentials. The client uses the client login to create that request access. That access is encapsulated. Do we understand encapsulation? That's our tunnel, right? Our encapsulation is each packet is wrapped around whatever pieces of encryption or pieces that it needs, and then it's unwrapped at the other end. So encapsulation is a good thing. Our AAA server is going to decrypt those credentials, check them, client validates to make sure that it has an open session, and then the server is going to process that request. With the accounting, right, the auditing, it's going to bookmark and keep track of those things, and then when that session is closed or somehow interrupted, the client-server exchange will stop, and we'll stop and exchange those packets, or at least they'll stop packets. So this would be my Radius client that they talk about. This would be my Radius server or my AAA server, as they're saying. So the client takes the connection and then talks back to the server for the authentication. If this were our internal network here, right, this whole thing, well, actually, let's stick over here. So let's say this is my internal network. Now they are just going to connect to the domain controller to authenticate. So all this stuff gets missed. So Radius brings that step in. Remember 802.1x? What's the big thing with 802.1x?
control, network control.
Correct.
basically on switches.
Correct. Hardware. So it is physical They talked about port authentication. The nice thing with 1X, as long as our hardware supports it and our software supports it, I connect to the hardware and it authenticates as opposed to me going through that whole connection. You will see 802.1x and you will see EAP, the Extensible Authentication Protocol.
A lot of questions and test questions on that.
On EAP? Yeah, because it can be used with so many different types of security. Right, we can do EAP with TLS, transport layer security. We can deal with other. Yeah.
There's like three questions about that.
Yep.
Different types of
EAP.
Might want to know that one. I've just been doing some tests and I noticed it comes up a lot.
Yeah. And we see more and more. Let's see what we got here. If I go. Right, protected, extensible authentication protocol is a protocol that encapsulates, excuse me, EAP within a potentially encrypted and authentication transport layer security. What layer is transport? 2, 3, 4?
3.
Close?
4. Is it 4?
Yep.
Yeah.
Data link is 2. Network is 3, and the transport is 4. So if we're looking at OSI model, right, when we deal with EAP, we are securing this a little bit further up in the OSI model because we're dealing at layer 4. If I said, what layer does 802.1x operate at? Right, it's hardware, so it could be down to layer 1, the physical cable. And then it's going to authenticate up on either network or transport. Physical, data.
No, I've known it for 10 years, but I don't know. I don't remember them. I can't, for some reason, I can't remember them. I have to remember them. Are they going to be on the test?
OSI is kind of a little bit everywhere. The code, please do not throw sausage pizza away. Please start at the bottom. So please is physical, do data, not network, throw, transport, sausage, session, pizza, presentation, application. And so what layers works or what applications work at the application layer? Right now I'm on it. A browser, right? Because it's taking the connection and it is presenting, it is displaying it. So layer 6 is presentation layer inside of my application layer. So we're right now visually working with layers 6 and 7, the presentation and the application layer. DNS works up there, HTTP, which we can see, HTTPS, that's in my browser right there. FTP, that works up at the top layers as well. Transport layer, TCP or UDP. Connection, connectionless. One of the questions you may see compares OSI to TCP/IP. So, because OSI, please do not throw sausage pizza away. So when we deal with OSI, we've got 7 layers. When we deal with TCP/IP, we are at 4. So each of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4. So TCP basically says, you know what, your session, your presentation, your application, they all work together. We're going to combine them into one. Network Plus will have that too, probably, or possibly. Knowing the TCP/IP model compared to the OSI model. When we troubleshoot, whether we know it or not, we are almost always following the OSI model. Hey, Jeremy, my computer's not working. What's going to be one of his first few questions?
Turned on.
Thank you. Turned on, plugged in, right? I did a lot of training for CenturyLink, all their DSL techs, their outdoor techs, their DSL support inside. And you hear all these funny stories. If we have time, there's a funny video I'll show. It's called the Internet Help Desk. I don't know if you've seen it. It's been around for years. But Internet Help Desk, the guys start, and it's a comedy group called Three Dead Trolls in a Baggie. I don't know where that name came from, but he starts off saying, I figure in society we have 4 essential groups: doctors, police, firemen, Internet Help Desk. And then it kind of goes on from there. So when we're troubleshooting, right, is it hardware? Is it plugged in? Yeah, Jeremy, my computer's turned on. It's plugged in. I see a green light on the back. Okay, well, that looks good. Hey, Kyle, let me try and ping your computer. Oh, can you get to the printer? No, I can or can't. Hey, you know what? Give me a minute. Let me go log into my switches. Let me go to the closet and see if there's a problem with the switch. So that's layer 2. So he's stepping up. Hey, Kyle, I went into the closet. For whatever reason, that port you were plugged in was amber. I switched ports. You should be working now. That would be resolved at layer 2. You know what, Kyle? All those were green. Let me go see how the router is. That's layer 3. So now he's stepping up. Your computer hardware is fine. The switching is fine. The routers are fine. You know what? What else did you do? Right, one of our other questions. What changed? Well, you know, I came in this morning and I updated my Google Chrome browser. So now I'm up at 5, 6, and 7. Now it's a software problem. Oh, did you install this? Well, you were supposed to wait, or I forgot to let you know that that doesn't work. Let's uninstall it and reinstall a different version. So whether we realize it or not, as we troubleshoot, we're going through those 7 layers.
Think like that.
To me, just logically, if we've been in the field long enough,
You go through those
you do.
steps like that. Yeah, typically you do.
Yep. As opposed to, hey, Jeremy, my computer's not working. Hey, what version of Google Chrome are you running? That's not his first question.
Right.
Most likely,
Well, unless Mike does updates and pushes something.
thank you, unless I say, hey, Jeremy, Kyle, is it your browser? Right? Where, okay, there's a known problem. Everybody's calling, right? Nobody can get into their Citrix client because something was updated and the firewall isn't allowing the connections. So we learn to troubleshoot based on the OSI model. Physical on up to the application. Very logical. And sometimes we skip, right? When we talk about troubleshooting, what does it mean if I ping my 127.001, my local loopback? Who has a 127.001? Everybody does. Every network interface, network card has a 127.001. Well, how can we all have the same address? Because it is unique to your NIC And if I ping your 127, this hardly ever happens nowadays. It used to happen quite a bit 10, 15 more years ago. When I ping 127.0.0.1, it tells me my own network card is working correctly. My local loopback is functioning. And then if I'm the IT guy, so Killian comes, sits at my desk and says, okay, your network card's working. Let me try and ping Jess, who's on the same network as you. I can see her, or hey, I can't see her, I can't see Steve, I can't see anybody else. If he can, then he's gonna say, well, let me ping the default gateway, right? That's the IP address that gets me out of my network. And can I get the gateway? Oh, I get a reply. Let me ping Jeremy, who's on that other network somewhere else. Oh, I can get to the router, I can't get to the other network. And then we work from there. The other option would be Killian just pings Jeremy and it doesn't work. But now he has to step back to figure out what does work. So again, it's very logical as far as, do I start local and move out? Do I start out and move back in? And if we start on the outside and we find a problem there, we still have to move back in to figure out, is it the router? Is it the switch? Oh, it's my own network card. So those are kind of when we deal with troubleshooting, we deal with Radius, we're dealing with Extensible Authentication Protocol, EAP. That is 802.1x. So we're talking hardware, we're talking software. And we've got all these, so a little bit of a review for OSI. So TLS is operating at that layer 4, right here.
Is it going to talk about the TCP/IP layers, or is it going to talk to OSI layers?
For the most part, it will be OSI on this one. Security Network Plus may say, which of the following models are you following when you troubleshoot this way? And if you go through 7, you know it's OSI. If you're going through 4, then it would be TCP/IP. When we're on break or before we leave today, I'm going to get everybody's email. I already have Jess's. Of course. No. And then I'm going to send you a link to my Security Plus OneDrive, because that's where I have, let me see. I apologize, my chest. So I'll send you a link to this, to my Security Plus directory. It has a Security Plus tools folder, so I've got that hash password, air cracking, IP scan, a net scanner, Nmap. So it'll have all those tools. It'll have, I've got some games. We're actually going to do one of those a little bit later. I've got the slide presentation if you want that. And then I've got, probably 40 or 50 different documents talking about just security. And I've got some of the test prep in there too. So high advanced available architecture, best practices for keeping your home network secure, BitLocker, Active Directory encryption procedure, BitLocker user guide, Bluetooth attacks, Bluetooth security, getting into common ports, right? So I think this sheet, if I open that, right, so this is one that basically has all the common ports on it. And so you don't have to obviously memorize all of them, but you will need to know the first 1,024 are reserved. And then we have a total of 65,536.
What's that denomination of? 65,000.
16 bits.
Okay.
Because 8 bits is 256, and then we go 512, 1,024, 2,048, 4,096, 8, 1632s.
So if you just add the extra.
Yeah. Now, if you don't know binary, you would just say, where'd that number come from? But there is logical sense kind of behind the scenes. So I've got all these different different files. I may have actually already shared it with you. I can't remember, Jess,
That? Oh, yeah, I heard.
because I think I did all three of them. Computer forensics, digital forensics, encrypted file system, so EFS, right? TPM, remember that what that was? That's that chip on your motherboard, right? So they talk about that. Enabling infrastructure, best practices. You don't have to worry about the schedule. Anyway, so right here, SSL with TLS. So I'll send you this link. You can just go through and figure out. I just kind of put a lot of things in there, but I typically try to make the title somewhat descriptive of what the document is. So like Cerberus, Kerberos, that's our Active Directory. So it's going to go through that process. Go ahead.
Is it gonna be available for a specific period of time?
Until I remove it. So for at least weeks or months. Well, and what I'll do, I think the default is like 2 weeks, but you can download all this stuff too.
And that's what I said.
Yeah. Yeah, as long as you-
Available for a specific period of time, download what you want.
Yeah, I usually try to keep it long enough.
Using that one to be sure.
Right, symmetric or asymmetric, we'll talk about those. So anyway, ebooks, practice exams. Here's one that is wonderful. This is my Security Plus cheat sheet. In fact, I usually try and print this off in class and give it to you. So Pam, this just,
Can't read it.
I've got two versions. I've got one that's 3 pages and one that's 5. And you can, they're on PDF. But anyway, this just summarizes, you know, the symmetric, asymmetric keys, bitlock, bitmap or BitLocker, code, malicious code, backdoor, man in the middle. And then it goes through all the acronyms, right? And so that's how it finishes up. So this is kind of a nice little just summary for your general FYI. Now, one thing, when you take the test, they're going to give you a legal size, you know, 11 or 8.5 by 14 roughly, felt pen, paper, whatever it is. And when you go in there, you're going to log in, and they'll give you about 10 minutes before you actually hit start. And so one of the suggestions is things like OSI model, write them down ahead of time on that cheat sheet. And what I tell a lot of people will be start your TCP IP or your IP4. So put 16, put 32 bits in there and do a 255000. And then if I want a network, I'm going to go with, do I want 16 hosts? Right? Or do I need 128? So instead of one C network, I slice it in half and I get 2 128s. And so you can kind of write some of that stuff down ahead of time. And then when you're taking the test, you don't have to think through it. You can just say, oh, I've already got it there, especially if there's topics you're not sure of.
So there's something that's going to be in there?
Not a lot on Security Plus, but that's just an example. Like Network Plus, that would be one of the first things I would suggest writing down. You know, because my subnet mask has to be all 1s and 0s.
Right.
You can't have them, it has to be, you know, congruent or, anyway, I forget the term I was thinking of. Contiguous. My IP address, I can have 1s and 0s all intermixed. When I'm dealing with the subnet mask, it has to be 1s and 0s. So my subnet mask can only be 255, 254, 252, 248, 240, 224, 192, 128, and 0. There's not, because it all depends where that 1 or 0 is in those 8 bits. So you know that if you have an IP address, and one of the questions that you may see, probably more NetPlus, but they'll have an IP address and you'll see a subnet mask of 255.255.163.0. Well, you can't have a subnet mask 163. because that means the bits and ones and zeros are intermixed. They have to have ones and they have to have zeros. If you want, we can go through some of that later. It's such a fun discussion. We don't deal with it a lot if you're a Cisco guy, right? Part of the fun I had with Jess in the Network Plus is that's when I was really sick. So I was not talking, and I was somewhat not even, I was somewhat delusional, but she has a good friend that does a lot of these things, works in the field. And so he was able to explain things to her in a way that maybe I could or didn't at the time. But even then, it's again, for a lot of us, you'll need to know it for the test. If you take the Cisco exam, you have to know this stuff inside, outside, and upside down. But for us in Network Plus, we do Security Plus maybe a little bit because as far as from the security aspect. So I digress, but here's some of the files that I'll include for you guys, and then you can just kind of print them. And there's a lot of very helpful things there. There's probably a lot of junk there too. I just put stuff up. Right, there's PKI from yesterday. Our UPS backups. Just general security guidelines. Wireless encryption protocols. Wireless security. So some of the times the book doesn't go into detail, so a lot of these things will. So I'll make sure we get that to you guys. All right. I'm 165. You guys are maybe 2 something.
Yeah.
What was it? 205?
No, minus 5.
Oh, 195?
There you go.
Even odd. All right. So federation and trusts. What do they mean by a federation? Or what do they mean by separate administrative controls? Jeremy answered this question about 10, 15 minutes ago when I had this slide here, and I said we have 3 types. Right? We have internet, intranet, and our extranet, right? That is federation. So a federation service is going to be something between Micron and Albertsons. And we have an actual role, a service that we can install on our server to allow me to authenticate, not with just other people, but with other organizations. And we have trusts.
Not even organizations, applications too.
Yeah. If it goes through the federation, if it's from one to another, absolutely. So I have I'll just do CNN. And we're large, so we're going to have another structure. We decided to design our structure. So we've got Idaho.CNN. I've got California.CNN. So by default, in Windows Server, I have a transitive trust. What do we mean by a transitive trust?
Basically, the application trickles down and go to through those, since they're in the same domain, so it's the
Same forest, same domain, absolutely. Which means because San Diego, California trusts, because California trusts CNN and San Diego trusts California, therefore San Diego trusts all the way to the top. That is a transitive trust, and in Windows Server, it is by default transitive. Because I trust C and C trusts B, therefore we all trust each other. So if that's a transitive trust, if I'm working with another organization, some other federation, by default it is not transitive, and that's what we want. I don't want by default everybody in the other organization, right? So if we're over here and now we're at ESPN, right, and we have this trust, I don't want these guys to automatically trust up there by default. So we create a one-way trust, right? So I have a one-way trust. Child trusts parent, but parent does not trust child. Two-way trust, child trusts parent, and parent trusts child, which is basically our transit. So in this case, if I want to, I create a one-way. So CNN would trust. And then I create another one-way if I want it to go back. So within Windows, it is by default transitive. Within federations, we create one-way trust, and then we just have to create two one-way trusts. Okay. So that's our transitive. Non-transitive would be just this part here, right? The non-transitive is a trust relationship remains only between those particular domains. So that would be a non-transitive as opposed to these guys by here. Now these guys would equal each other. So you'll see some questions on that as far as transitive, non-transitive trusts in federation. Net Plus, Security Plus, Windows Server, all those. We have a couple different languages. What is a markup language? Let's just ask that question real quick. We see markup languages every day, all day long. Right? Web pages. Anytime I go to a browser and I view a web page, it is displaying hypertext markup language. And if you have or have not seen HTML, it's what we call a tag-based language. So I have a tag called bold. And then I put Kyle. And then I have a an end tag. So whatever is between the start, in between those tags will be bolded. And this is just basic HTML. Now we can also introduce VB scripting and Java scripting and active server pages and .NET and C# and all these. That's where the dynamics come in. Cascading style sheets, yes. If you ever want to look at your HTML, you can typically just right-click on the page and say View Source. So if you want to see what, so I did a search here, what is the darknet with a PDF? And if I say View Page Source, it will open up, and this is in Google Chrome. So that's HTML. Make it a little bigger, just so we can kill more brain cells. Now, if you have not worked with HTML, if you start looking through it, a few things will start to make sense. We see a word here up at the top, schema, right? It says, what is the, so it starts off with the document type. It tells me it's an HTML. Now this is a little bit extra, but this is dealing with the section right here with our markup languages. The item type, it is an HTTP web page, right? And then I can see that I've got my header. So I've got, this would be my beginning tag like this. And then I would have an end tag probably further down. Right? So let's look at this one here. So here's my title. What is the darknet PDF for Google search? And there's my end title tag. And if I look up here, what do I see? What is the darknet PDF dash Google? what is the darknet PDF dash Google? So this tag right here tells this page that it is going to mark up or add this language here. And it goes on and on and on and on and on and on. And then it's going to go to servers and back and forth and secure things. So and we can see here push, so there's probably a button there. Google return, so we see search queries. Parents, right? Protocols, functions, login URLs. Anyway, there's a lot of different things that we can do there. So that is what a markup language is. And if I use a new browser, it will support the new versions of HTML. So, Security Association markup language, federation or single sign-on. Shibboleth, I don't remember seeing a test question on that. I do remember seeing SAML as far as a security markup, and I do remember single sign-on, not necessarily as a markup language. Now, when we're talking SAML, right, so they're 196, 197, right? So we can go through and, again, we're typically dealing with a browser, and it is based on what we call XML. Now, I'm not going to go into tons of detail on that, except when we see XML, it becomes basically universal code, because now I create a tag called KJ, and then I put whatever it is in there, and then I put my end tag KJ, and then I can import that into another data source, another document. So XML, extensible markup language, that's where now we can create custom elements. So we kind of create our custom tags. So if I were to give this to Killian, and I'm in SQL, so I'm in one product and he's in another product completely, if he knows these tags, he can just bring it in. So it becomes a universal way to communicate, a customized universal way, because things in SQL will display differently than Oracle. But if I say over here it's a custom tag called Kyle F name, then he knows Kyle F name is going to be the first name. So, and that's what our SAML is using, is extensible markup language. OpenID, OpenConnect. I don't know if, bookmark those pages. You'll probably just need to know the, I apologize, kind of the difference between as far as authentication, dealing with our federation services. That's going to be key, as we're talking about protocols or communications from one organization to a different organization. You'll need to know for the test, real world, these are not things that I've dealt a little bit with SAML, but I have not dealt with federations and services as far as organizations like that, at least in a long time. So we'll need to know more of those for the exam. You'll need to know that Shibboleth is basically open source SAML. But I do remember, crap, I do remember seeing some of those questions. SAML I saw, Shibboleth I don't think so. The main thing is to know that those 4 or 5 are federation protocols.
So, this is probably just a dumb question because we never had an answer for it. But why do they put questions on here that really don't pertain to the real world and aren't used that much?
Because they want to make sure you know the way they think.
So that's kind of like drinking, giving us a Kool-Aid. I don't want to drink the Kool-Aid.
You know, after a couple shots of something, it doesn't matter what you drink.
Yes.
No, and that I don't have a.
I know so really it's just a rhetorical question.
I don't have a good answer, except I have that same frustration. The only thing I've kind of figured out over time is by asking some of those questions, they know you have a little bit deeper knowledge than just the basics.
Okay.
But you're absolutely correct. A lot of those things we are never going to see again.
Right.
But for the test, we do have to know. So I just apologize on behalf of CompTIA.
Well, you're not them, so, but yeah, you just want to talk to somebody and figure out what their thoughts are.
Yeah, I would love to be a fly on the wall in some of their meetings.
Well, they probably laugh hysterically. Oh.
I was listening to a TED Talk earlier. He was a comedian. He goes, "So what is this fly on the wall?" He goes, "You know, flies don't have ears, so they can't hear what's being said in the room. And even if they read lips, they can't do anything with it. And you only live 2 days. Why would you want to be a fly on the wall?" It was pretty funny. He was taking it a little literal. All right, we're at 2:30. Take a few minutes. We'll come back and get into Unit 5, Unit 6, or Unit 5 and then Module 3. In fact, I will do this. When you are gone, I'm going to give you a little activity that you can do during the break or after. You can do this as a group or individually. You can start it here and take it home. If you go into my Security Plus folder that I share with you, I have a folder called Security Plus Games, and all these things are in there too. Anyway, just goof around, see what you can map or match. Unit 5, I'm going to go through some of the bullet points, and then the virtual machine is loaded, and then I'm just going to get into Active Directory, and we're just going to look at some of the things there, because that's a big part of it. But here we'll talk about DACL, or DAC, MAC, RABAC, and ABAC, ABAC. We're all talking about access, right? Last section we talked, what was probably the main word? Authorization, right? Once we are authorized, we are allowed to, or excuse me, what was the first day? Authorized? Accounting? Authentication? Okay, so I was right. So the last one was authentication. Once we know who you are, here we're dealing with how do you access and how do I authorize you? Sorry. So we'll get into privilege. We've kind of talked about that. And then I'll get into Active Directory, and we'll look at the rights, roles, security, and then look at auditing there as well. So we have 4 types. For me, I'm on page 171. It's the first page inside Module 2, Unit 5. These 4 bullets, put a little bookmark. You'll just need to understand the difference between the 4, and they'll give you little scenarios as far as you're trying to do this type of access. Would it be discretionary, role, mandatory, or attribute? Okay, so a discretionary access control, Microsoft adds an L, so discretionary access control list, a DACL. So here we're dealing with just a basic rights and permissions, roles, right? So our RBAC adds more on top of that. Excuse me. And at that point, we now have administrators that are coming in, and we separate Tier 1 to Tier 2 to Tier 3. So now we're actually dealing based on your job description or the role that you have. I'm going to allow access. If we looked at discretionary or DAC, that would be more just like a local or a work group. So it's the least, but that's kind of one of those things where at least I'm requiring you to log in, but I'm not necessarily doing anything beyond that. Role-based is now where we start, that's Active Directory. I've got user accounts and computer accounts. Mandatory is where we now deal with, like if you have top, not necessarily what groups you are, but if you have top security clearance, now you have access. So mandatory, so if you have secure, top secure, confidential, depending on what your responsibility is, I'm giving you a certain level of clearance. So I don't care if Jeremy's a user or Jess is an admin, if they both have top security, then I'm granting access that way. So that's our MAC. Don't get that confused with your MAC address or the physical address. We finished with that. Yeah, we talked about the transitive trusts and how like the Shibboleth is the open source version.
Right, and that was the last one, so that's where we stopped, was there. We didn't do that, that's fine.
Oh, okay, well we can.
No,
No, you're right. I did say just bookmark those so that you can identify that those are all Federation protocols, because they won't necessarily have you know the difference between them. Just know that OpenID is how I'm dealing with like certain sign-ons with websites, or open source is dealing with certificates, or for the Shibboleth. XML, we drew that on the board.
No, we got all of that. I'm saying from those from the Shibboleth, whatever it was.
Yeah.
Shibboleth, the last page and a half, we didn't go over, and I left it sitting there, but I marked it, so I'll just read through it.
Yeah. So the big thing is just know that they're Federation protocols. So like between organizations. So not your own username and password, but another level. And then attribute-based control. Attributes, we now get to another level. When we're dealing with Windows Server, this is like advanced administration, advanced options. So now what I'm saying is, when I go into your user account, if it has your state attribute as Idaho, I'm giving you access based on that. Okay, so these are all rule-based access controls. So attribute is just, right, user account has a state, first name, a department. So I'm granting access based on the attribute of your account. The mandatory is your security level. Role-based is just going to be your users and groups. And then discretionary is just, at least it's something to log in. And that's more of our local work group. And if you see a question, it'll be more, like I said, kind of a scenario. You're trying to implement this type of security for the power company, and you need to provide access based on their clearance levels, and you would need to know that that's going to be, you know, your mandatory access as opposed to attribute. All right, so now the next several pages I'm going to do through our virtual machine. So I'm going to highlight the bullets real quick verbally, and then we're just going to look on board. So if we go to our file system, for us in Windows, that's our NTFS. It used to be FAT32. The new file system, remember what that was? I think it came up early last week. The resilient file system, where now we can deal with drives that are in the exabytes in size. Hard to fathom how large that particular size is. So local accounts compared to service accounts. What are service accounts?
They're just service accounts, they're used for services.
Other software, absolutely.
Okay, so we had a question about this, and I
Okay.
asked questions which was wrong, and I told the computer it was wrong multiple times, and it didn't believe me, but they said you have somebody, a service tech coming in to work and you don't want them to have privileges, what type of an account do you give them? And it said you give them a service account. I said, no, you don't. You give them, it was a or a guest account, is what it should have been. You don't give them a service account because that's what you use for other software on that.
Yeah, so somebody, based on services, that's saying like Exchange Server has access or
Right,
SQL
your
Server.
SQL service,
Yeah.
right, or it's
Yeah.
right, or the industrial, right,
Yeah, so
right.
it's either wrong or there was a word that tried to trick you. But yeah, so we have local accounts. If we deal with local accounts, maybe at home, but I think at home you just turn it on and everybody has the same password, you log in. But if you want to deal with security at home. So we've got local accounts, service accounts, then we get into our network. And that's what we're going to look at in a little bit. So we have our users and our groups. That's probably what you guys deal with more at work with Active Directory. Somebody forgets their password, right? That's their domain account. So we're now talking Active Directory. We talked about shared accounts, how we don't like shared accounts, or what becomes difficult when we use shared accounts. If the whole IT staff at Nampa used a shared account,
That's auditing.
yes, who, what, where, when, why. And then our guest account, one of the first things we probably want to get rid of or at least disable. In fact, I think it's still disabled by default, right? Because it's just a shared account, no password. All right, so Windows Active Directory. Crap. I'm going to show you the domain controllers right now. We're going to look at the trees and forests right now. We are going to look at organizational units right now. The naming convention. So I'll stop there and then we'll look at the different types of accounts. So crap. All right, so we're running Windows 2012 R2. This is in our server class, so let me oh, nice. Password. So as a Windows admin, so the job, we just looked at it at wherever that was. This would be, when they say Active Directory, this is the kind of tool that you would be familiar with. So we see a couple things just for refresh. So we have our dashboard. So this is kind of following the Windows 8, right? Where we have tiles, the dashboard concept, Windows 8.1, big in Windows 10. So we can see if there's local servers, all servers, Active Directory, directory service. So this tells me I'm running a domain and I'm running DNS. Can I run Active Directory without DNS? No. You must have them together. And Microsoft highly, 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 highly suggests or recommends that DNS and Active Directory are on the same physical box. Now, you can have other DNS servers out there to support and load balancing and queries, but for us, Active Directory and DNS should be on the same physical box. By default, it is. There's a big security thing. When I make a change, right, DNS is resolving name to IP. So when I log in, I get a new IP address. DNS has a record that says Killian's computer name has this new IP address. And because it's a computer account, Active Directory has to get that changed. So when we put these together, it's what we call an Active Directory integrated zone. DNS replicates with Active Directory replication, and it's secure, dynamic, encrypted updates. So that's the suggestion, that's the recommendation. It is the default. So whenever we see AD, we're almost always going to see DNS. And then we have our different tools down here. These will actually change colors based on good, bad, or indifferent. So we can see they're green, they're good here. I'll show you. So we have our option here where we can add roles, add additional servers, and create server groups for management. I almost always come up here. So I'm going to go there first just to kind of show you what else. So I'm going to go to add, remove roles. Skip that. Is it features or remote desktop? We're staying with roles. And if you had multiple servers, so Pam said that it's better to have a service per server. This is where I could say if I've got multiple servers, I want to install this on A, B, or C. So we have that option there. Right now it's just one. So when we said Microsoft Server gives you options to do things, these are all the different things that it can do. First option, that was yesterday's conversation, right? Certificates. So I can install Active Directory certificate services. This is the one we just talked about in the last unit, Federation services. Okay. So we can install that and manage connections between there. Active Directory, lightweight directory services. Okay, so this is not necessarily LDAP, but this is if we're dealing with kind of multiple Active Directory environments. Rights management service, management services. So this is going to deal with licensing issues. I have an application server. So this is going to be if I'm going to install other services there. We almost always have DHCP somewhere. Right, and in this case, we install DHCP. We create our own scopes. Now, for DHCP, I can install this or run this in two places. I can either run it on a server or I can run it on a router. So I can go into Cisco. All right, so if I have my router, let me switch that. And I have an interface that goes to segment 1, and I've got 100 devices here. I can install DHCP right there, and it will assign IP addresses to those 100 devices. So I can install it on the router interface. And if I have other segments, right, so we've got segment 2, then I can install DHCP there for that segment. Now, there is a reason why we would do this on each interface. DHCP has a particular conversation that we do not like. It's called a broadcast. We like broadcast because everybody hears it. We don't like broadcast because everybody hears it. So DHCP goes through a broadcast to give you an IP address. That's why if our lease is every 8 days, that's not bad. If I set a lease to every 10 minutes, right? How often does when does DHCP try to renew your IP address? If I give you an 8-day cycle, does DHCP wait 8 days and then say, oh, let me give you another address or reassign it? It doesn't. It goes 50%. So if I have a lease for 8 days, 4 days into it, it's going to say, hey, Jeremy, do you need an IP address? Oh, you have the same one. Another 8 days, 4 days later, on and on and on. If we go 8 days and we go 4 days into it and you're down, it doesn't get a response, it waits another half and then finally another half and it says, hey, listen, you're not here, it's been 8 days. Let me grab that address, put it back into my pool, and then when you reconnect, we'll go there. So if we have leases set for 1 hour, 30 minutes later, 45 minutes later, 52 minutes later, and then finally it comes back. But if we don't have a lot of addresses to give out, a shorter lease is good because I'm getting them back quicker. If I have plenty, or I don't have a problem, a longer lease is going to be better that way. So in this case here, I have DHCP on each router interface. What do routers block? Broadcasts. I put a router there, I segment and put a router to stop broadcasting. Now it can still send messages and transmit data, but a router is there to block broadcast. So DHCP has a problem now. If I have DHCP here, and I'm trying to get over here, the router blocks it. So I have two options. Put DHCP server here. What's the other thing we can do? It's not a proxy server, but it's some relay agent. So now I have a client over here that responds for these 100 people, and it can talk to DHCP through the router. So now, instead of broadcast being well, they can't go through, I have these 100 people talk to the relay, and it does it on behalf of that. And so we have our relay agents as well. Fax server, still use them, I guess, from time to time. Here's my Hyper-V. So if I wanted to install virtualization, here's that network policy and access services. So I would install that if I want to make sure that your computer has the right version of operating system and the right updates and the right software. So I go in and set up a network policy, and if you do have it, I let you on the network. If not, I quarantine you. Print, document services, remote access, volume license activation. So if I've got 1,000 people, I don't want to go to each machine and activate. I can do that on a volume basis. We have our web server, software deployment services, and then we have basically our updates. So now we can have our own Windows Update server. Do you guys have your own SUS server? Do you know?
Yeah.
You do? Okay. So now you test updates, and then you approve the updates. And so when everybody, if you tell everybody, hey, go to your Windows updates and run updates, they're thinking, oh, I'm getting the updates. Whereas they're talking to Mike's server, not necessarily to Microsoft, because he's either approved or not. So that's a nice service too. So these are additional roles that I can install. So this is where Microsoft gives me options for kind of everything. Once we install it, we configure it, and we're typically good to go. This isn't a, hey, it's Monday, Killian wants to come in and install something just for the heck of it kind of a thing. So we're going to go, so we got our Active Directory. We can see London-DC1 is our domain controller. Domain controllers are probably the most important server on the network. That, when we talked earlier about the physical infrastructure and the logical, this is the logical piece. The domain controller is what has my users and computers and all those types of accounts. So we just need to know that a domain controller, it just does that. It controls my domain structure. And I have, hopefully I have at least 2 domain controllers on the network, because when a change occurs on one, it replicates to the other. When a change occurs on the other, it replicates to the one. They load balance, so if one's busy, the other one can respond. So if we look at that, then we look at our domains. So DNS, this is, again, our internal DNS server. So if I go to my tools and go to DNS, all right, so here's the other place where we go. In fact, this is probably where we're spending more time. Not over in installing roles, but in tools. Active Directory users and computers, we'll go there in a few minutes. I've got DNS. If I had installed DHCP, it would be there. There's my event viewer. We'll kind of just look at that briefly. Resource monitor, performance monitor, Windows PowerShell, firewall events, etc. So I'm just going to select DNS. So right now, we can see a couple things. One, this is Active Directory integrated. So it's working together. We have two zone types. I have a forward zone and I have a reverse zone. Guess what the reverse does? Goes the other way, right? I have an IP address. I need to know the name, as opposed to here's the name to an IP address. So when we look here under this forward zone, and this is short just because there's no other clients really logged in, but we have our start of authority records. We'll get into that next couple days or so. But I can see here that I have my domain, right, adatum.com, and this is what I want to look at. So I have my when I create a forward lookup zone, it gives me these two files or these two forward zones. They are just doing different pieces. You don't need to worry about this first one. The one we want is this one. And we can see here we've got London Client 1, London Client 2, London DC 1, London Router, London Server 1, Server 2. And they have a name to an IP address. And then we see the type of record that it is. We have a start of authority record, or a host record, excuse me. A host record is an A record, just named to IP. What other records could I see there? MX record. That tells me that it is a email server. So when your computer starts up, if it needs to know where the email server is, guess where it gets that information? Through DNS. And DNS is smart enough to say that, hey, if you're starting up in this building, I'm going to locate the closest server to you, and it handles that for us. So when we talk DNS, when we talk domains, this is the domain structure. Right now, we're just running a single domain, single forest. Remember the diagram earlier? In Windows NT, we were limited to 40,000 objects, in which case I had to create a subdomain. So I'd have to create idaho.adatum.com or utah.adatum.com. But now that we can have millions and millions of objects, we theoretically don't need to. But we still may for design purposes if we choose to. So this is our DNS. This is our domain structure. If in doubt, right click. So this is where I can create new records. What's a AAAA record? IP6. So an A record is 4, an AAAA record is a really good Alcoholics Anonymous group. But that's our IP6. There's my MX record, mail exchange record. I can create other ones. I can create secure DNS zones. And this is where I can now come in and create a new domain. Got to spell it right. And so now, within Adatum, I have Idaho. And so now I can manage records in Idaho and so forth. So we talk about some of the reasons I subnet is to what? Control based on physical location or job description or role. There's one other thing that we would create multiple subnets or multiple zones for, and that is replication. Cannot forget replication. Because within Active Directory, it will replicate as if it's a high-speed network, a LAN. If I have to replicate between Pocatello and Boise, it assumes by default it is a slow link or a WAN connection. Even though your WAN may be fiber and connected, it's going to assume that. Active Directory replicates whenever a change occurs. So I may want to create other DNS zones to keep that replication within Idaho, Utah, Montana. If I keep everything as a datum, it replicates everywhere whenever there's a change. So we have replication, we have security. There's a third option for DNS and Active Directory. What does it mean to delegate control?
It's basically assigned permissions.
It's right? When people have to move houses, I'm a great delegator. I sit there and direct traffic. I don't move anything, I just direct it. So with delegation of control, we are assigning the responsibility that we choose to that zone. So now I can say, Killian is in charge of Idaho, and I am delegating control just for Idaho. He can't do anything in Utah unless I specify. Jess is going to be delegated to Utah, Montana. So I can now, instead of me having to do everything, hey, Killian's, he passed the test, he's done this, he's proven that he can do this, let me increase his job title, his job description, and now I'm delegating Idaho to him. Now, again, what's nice about delegation is I can say, you are basically the god of Idaho, you can do whatever you want. So he could create a nampa.idaho.data or boise.idaho.data. Or I could say, no, for Idaho, all you can do is reset passwords. So I can choose the level of delegation as well. Then I don't have to worry about him doing other things. I can say, okay, here's the responsibilities. So replication, security, and delegation. Those are the three things for DNS and for Active Directory. Questions on the domains. Who decides how you name your domain? Mike? Government?
If you're internal or external.
Okay, right, yesterday we talked about if I'm a consultant, one of the first things I look for if you want to name your company is that namespace available on the public side? Could I name my internal organization Microsoft? I could, depending on how I'm connected to the internet. As long as I'm behind a NAT server and firewall, yeah, it doesn't matter. Now, it would create problems as far as troubleshooting and other things. So if I wanted to go with Microsoft, I would say Microsoft.local or something else to differentiate between those. So basically with DNS, it is either assigned to us by the government or my boss, or I am the one that is putting that naming structure into place. This is that 90%, 5% black, 5% white, 90% we can do what we want. We can keep it all as a datum, we can go based on city, we can go based on zip code, so we have a lot of options there. So that's our domain structure. Then we go to our Active Directory, users and computers, and they bring up a word called organizational units, and that's what we're seeing here. I have built-in accounts or built-in folders, and I have organizational units, and that's all it does is it just organizes objects. If I go to IT, we'll see I've got, I don't know, 40 or 50 user accounts. That's great, but what if I wanted to say, I want to organize, let's go a new organizational unit called Tier 1. Tier 2. Remember that example yesterday with group policy, where I can apply policy to Tier 2, or I can apply it to IT and everybody in that will get it. So now I go to IT and I can say, well, these guys are all a part of Tier 1. Yes. These guys are all part of Tier 2. So now I've managed or at least organized these differently. Again, based on job description, title, physical location, it's my choice. But I use an organizational unit to manage my users, my computers, so I could come in. So they have a sales group, research group, marketing, managers. And again, you just right click and say, oh, let me add something else. So that act I just did of creating these two organizational units and moving users into them, that would replicate to all the other domain controllers. So now all domain controllers would have the updated information. We can see that there's a naming strategy. That's going to be up to you. Just realize that you typically need to have a name that will tell you the who, what, where, when, why. What is this doing? Where does it reside? What operating system is it running, perhaps? But that's a dangerous part too, because right now, if I were to hack in or see this, I have a very good idea what our clients and what our servers immediately. So we need to be aware of that. Questions on that? So that's Active Directory. This is our domain. So when we say, I want to log on to the domain at work, at Taos or wherever it is, this is what's running behind the scenes. Somebody came in and said, let me create a new user, bless you, and I put in the name, the last name, the full name. I can choose the login name. I can say part of a datum, whatever it may be. So the reason we don't see Idaho.datum is all I did was create a zone. I didn't create a subdomain. I would do that somewhere else.
Is Taos nobody's in here?
Nope. Probably the night group from last week, CISSP. All right, so we create a new user. And again, I add a new user. Jess, she would be replicated to all the domain controllers. So let's select, I don't know, Kyrell. No, let's do Kim. If I want to go in and manage my user account, so in this case, this is the next couple pages. They talk about manage groups, manage users. So I could come in here and say, let me right click and go to properties. So we talked earlier about attributes, right? Based on your role, do you get high security or top security clearance? Based on your group membership, how do I do it? Based on your attributes. So I could say here, anybody from the 83646 zip code is allowed access or not. So that's how we can get. So these are all the default attributes or parameters I get with a user account, right? Login. What hours can he or she log into? Well, let's just say Monday through Friday, 5 a.m. to 8. We're going to permit it. But you know what? There's always problems Wednesday. So let's do it till noon. So we can come in and control this. Now I don't worry about Kim logging in over the weekends. This is what she's allowed to do. By default, in a domain, I can log into any computer on the domain. That's either good or bad. So Pam is a user. She could go to the 4th floor, sit down at a computer, put in her username and password, and by default, it would give her a login. We could also say, no, I want, see right there, all computers. No, I want, what was it, Lun CL1. She or he can only log on to this one or other machines. So now I can say, no, Pam doesn't need to log on to other computers. I'm only allowing this specific one. So we're getting very granular here. Just because we can do it doesn't mean we need to. Somebody tries too many login accounts, guess what? That's checked. Hey, can you unlock my account for me? Killian is in charge of Idaho.datum. Yes, I will unlock your account. But you know what? I'm also going to say next time you log in, you need to change your password. Or, you know what? I'm not letting you change your password. Or I don't want it to never expire. Killian's a contractor. He's here for 1 month, so let's do this. Let's say the account expires November 15th. And then we can get it. We have other options as far as secure, Cerberus 128, 256. It doesn't require it. Am I using a smart card? So if I have that secure ID, I can say yes. they have to use that, or they are. So a lot of options there. Profile, right? Where's your home folder? Where's your profile directory? Telephone, if you have a voice over IP phone, I can associate that with your user account there. Your job title, department, company, who's your manager, who does he or she report directly to. So some of these we now start to get into other things that we won't do. Remote control, most people don't need remote control, but you know what? Kim is an administrator. I want to give her user account remote control access, but it does require. But she can also say, hey, Jeremy, I know you're having a problem. Sit back and I will interact with your screen so you can see what I'm doing. Or she could say, you know what? I just want to see what he's doing without him knowing I'm there. And then we have our remote desktops profile. Com Plus, we really don't have to deal with ever. And then we get into members of. Right, Kim is a member of the domain users, a member of IT. I could. No.
Is that remote control setting interact with MSTSC?
Mm-hmm.
That's what's using that?
Yep. The remote procedure call.
Yeah.
Excuse me, the remote desktop services. Yep. Which is 3389, I believe, if you're doing reports. Now, a lot of companies don't use the built-in remote desktop. We do here. We're small. I just go down here, go to my remote desktop connection. I know my IP address in the other room is 102. So if this were disabled on my account here, I wouldn't be able to do this.
I think I didn't have 80 questions on the
Yes, they will have some, like domain user accounts, domain groups, those things.
not the detail, not the user.
Probably not specific user attributes and stuff. Right, so it's right now it's loading my screen. So a lot of times I'll disable that because I'm using a team viewer, log me in, whatever tool there is, VNC, there's a bunch of free ones. But what's nice here is every operating system since XP, I think has it. I believe XP does. Crap, today's my son's birthday. I just saw a notification. Oh no, it's tomorrow, the 17th. I thought today was the 17th. Never mind. I can't talk to him anyways. He's down in Houston. Network access permissions. So this is where we have a network policy and it's controlling it there. I can actually say when Jeremy calls in, make sure he's calling from this specific phone number. Otherwise, I'm not going to allow it. And I have a no callback option or a callback, which means, hey, listen, when you call in, I'm going to call back and make sure you're still at that number. Don't typically deal with that, although we can. Static IP, so when Jeremy logs in, he's going to always get the same IP address. That could be beneficial, at least for administrators, because then you know when I'm logged into my office, I always have the same IP address. So that could do, and then we could also create static routes if we choose to or not. So those are our user accounts. And notice when I go to my computer account and go to properties, there's quite a bit less. Operating system, right? And if you're not sure what the version is, you can look it up. I think 7.0 is the 2016. I believe 8 will be 2019. Not exactly sure, but this typically is going to be, so 6, 6.1, 6.2, 6.3. This computer is just a member of the computers, right? We talked about Killian having delegation. I can delegate control. Where does this reside? Do I have Pocatello? Do I have Idaho Falls? And I can move the computer there. Who's in charge? And then does that computer have access for dial-in? All right, so user accounts, computer accounts, this is all domain. right now, the last 20, 30 minutes, this is Active Directory. This is Microsoft's main server product. Can you do this at home? Yes, if you've got the software. I do. I'm a geek. Jess, if she had the software, and you can download this software, and I believe it still gives you a 6-month trial. So if you just have a machine kind of doing nothing, this doesn't take a lot of resources. Then you can have your spouse or your kids, you can create their own accounts. So now my daughter has an account, my wife has an account, my son. If friends come over, I have accounts for them. Now it's definitely overkill, but for us, it's practice, it's learning, it's testing. So we can do those kind of things. And then our group policy management. So this is the other place where we do a lot. This is probably where Mike is when he's creating GPOs and linking them. Notice I have organizational units here. Notice this. I won't go there, never mind. But I do want to show you, they talk about passwords. So when we talk about strong passwords, I go to my default domain policy. Let's go to GPOs. There's my default domain controller domain. I'm going to edit. And this is where I was telling you, Mike was saying that there's probably more, but we have policies for computers. We have policies for users. What are the 5 times? Computer starts, shuts down, users log in or log off. What was the 5th one, Killian? GP update. I say that because you answered it the other day.
Yep.
So I go to my policies. Do you guys do software installations through group policy?
Yeah.
Okay. So you can install software. Everybody in the office gets Office 2016 when they log in, or when they open up Word, I can trigger the installation. So a lot of options there. That's a big one. Let it build. There's my administrative templates, and this is where, if I go to all settings, so this is computer configurations. I have 1,984 settings that I can enable or disable for computers on my network. If I go to my user, I go to policies, administrative. Now we're at 1578. This is Windows 2012. 2016 would have more, 2019 even more. If you get a chance, go through, look at them, see what's there.
Sorry, why does it look like some of those are different?
Let's see.
Each one has the same name, there's different on each side.
So this one here, users are queried to choose whether to allow a page to be loaded. Users can load a page. So they are very slightly different.
The title of the study.
Yes, yeah, sometimes they'll do like a parent, open, close paren. But you will see certain ones. So I can control ActiveX. And this is nice, and this is where kind of the review comes in, right? This is at least 2003 server, at least Windows XP. This allows or stops the use of the active control snap-in. So anyway, we have all these different options, all these different settings. This is where I now say, I'm going to create this policy. Let's create a new GPO, and we'll call it tier all. So I have this tier all. I can come in and edit it. I'm not going to change things, but I could come in and say, oh, let's go blah, blah, blah here. Let's enable this. Let's disable this. So I have this secure policy that lets my tier 1 groups do things or not. If I go to IT, I can say tier 1, I'm going to link that GPO that I just created, right? And let me also link that to tier 2. So now tier 1 and tier 2 will all get whatever settings I just applied. Now, if they're user settings, they'll apply when they log in. If they're computer settings, when the computer starts. So we can start to see how granular we can get. I can lock down computers, users, 3,500 settings across the two of them. Okay, so this is where we're getting to. A GPO can link to multiple containers. So that, like there, I just did it to tier 1 and tier 2. So those are the things that we get with Active Directory. Those are the tools that we are almost always working in with Windows Server. Users and computers, GPOs, and then DNS or DHCP or whatever service we have installed. But I didn't show you because this is the one I actually wanted to show you. What's that?
That's all sysadmin's job.
There you go. Yeah, I don't want the responsibility of it.
I've given nothing to the security person. At least for a word.
And get to do it.
Pardon?
And you get to do it.
Okay.
And the
Oh.
class that comes in here.
Gotcha. Thank you. Sorry, I lost track of time.
That is good.
All right. Anyway, go home. Have fun. Here's my password policy, and that finishes that slide or that section. So I can create my policies, 24, 42 days, 1 day, 7 characters, etc. All right. Thank you for sticking around a few minutes. Sorry, I got in trouble. If you want to do homework, just finish kind of reviewing that module 5. Most of it ties into what I just did on the monitor, on the projector.
Your mom.
Have a great night. We'll see you, Jess.
Use this highlighter.
Sir?
Get my email address for you for that
Yeah.
stuff.
Please do.
So take advantage of that.